I'm Ben Meiselas from the MeidasTouch network. As things start to heat up again in Fani, Willis, the Fulton County District Attorney's criminal investigation into Donald Trump's 2020 election interference, we are starting to learn more about the specific pieces of information that may form the basis of these racketeering charges that many, including myself, expect the Fulton County District Attorney's Office to bring against Donald Trump and others who were involved in his criminal conspiracy to interfere with the 2020 election. And just so you know, what a racketeering charge allows a prosecutor to do, and it's often used in mafia cases, is to basically charge everybody the same way who are involved in a conspiracy, from the mafia foot soldiers all the way up to the top, to the boss. And if you take that and you bring that into the context of Donald Trump's 2020 election interference, and since Trump essentially acts like a mob boss, you could basically charge him with the same criminal conduct as the operatives who were effectuating his desires to engage in 2020 election interference. And so some of the very powerful information and evidence that we believe Fani Willis has is also coming from this CNN report that just broke, and that is these text messages that CNN managed to get their hands on. These text messages between these Trump operatives, and in these text messages, these Trump operatives discuss using election data that they obtained when they breached local election offices in various counties across the country, from Antrim County in Michigan to Coffee County in Georgia. And then they ultimately tried to take that data, misrepresent the data in filing their various lawsuits and preparing various reports to basically attack Dominion and attack the integrity of the elections and to manipulate the data that they stole. And so if I can sequence this in a timeline, like you'll recall from prior reports that we did here, one of the things that Donald Trump wanted to do and that Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell were trying to get done, and Mike Flynn and others, was to convince people at the Department of Homeland Security, all the way up to Chad Wolf, who was the acting secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, and his top deputy, Ken Cuccinelli, to actually seize voting machines after the 2020 election. Now, why would they want to seize the voting machines? Because they wanted to try to take the data from that and then try to recraft the data, manipulate the data in their various lawsuits, because they had absolutely no evidence at all that there was fraud permeating the election in any way at all, yet alone a meaningful way to overturn the results of the 2020 election. And ultimately, Cuccinelli and Chad Wolf, as much of yes men as they were to Donald Trump, they just said, look, we literally don't have the powers here at the Department of Homeland Security to do it. Like, if we could, we may try to do it, but that's just not what we do. And then the Department of Defense also rejected out of hand these requests to seize voting machines. So then where did Donald Trump go next? Well, Sidney Powell and Giuliani, essentially on behalf of Donald Trump, basically reached out to these people like Jim Penrose. You're going to start hearing this name, Jim Penrose. He used to work at the NSA. He was one of these people who was accessing this breached election data. So you got Jim Penrose, you got Doug Logan. Who's Doug Logan? Doug Logan is the CEO of that organization called the Cyber Ninjas, which was ultimately hired by the MAGA Republicans in Arizona to do the fake audit there, which was completely exposed as a total and utter sham. And then you had this individual by the name of Charles Bundren. And so you'll start hearing those three names a lot: Penrose, Logan, and Bundren. And, CNN got their hands on text messages between these individuals, specifically as it relates to communications about breached election data in Georgia. So what happened? So you have these Trump officials who are unable to get their hands on the election data by seizing the voting machines, right? That's the first thing Trump wants to do. So then what do? they send these individuals in. I'm not saying it's Penrose, Logan, and Bundren per se, but other individuals as well, who went into these county election offices. So in Georgia, in Coffee County, there were like 2 individuals who went into the Coffee County election offices and managed to basically seize. Another word for seize would be steal. They managed to basically steal private election data from this Coffee County office, and that happened on January 7th. So a day after the January 6th insurrection, these 2 Trump operatives, they go into this Coffee County election office. They literally take the data. They have someone on the inside. It's a kind of MAGA Republican leaning district. They take the election data, and then they share the data with Penrose and Logan and Bundren, who then uploads it into this database, also kind of run by Sidney Powell and Giuliani. And then the question is, well, what do they do with this election data? Well, they want to weaponize the data in their various lawsuits, in their various reports, and try to show that Dominion was flawed, that the election data that was publicly reported was flawed. And so they tried to get their hands on the data and then manipulate it. So CNN got their hands on some of these text messages, and what it shows is they weren't just trying to weaponize the data to overthrow the 2020 election for Donald Trump, but also the Georgia senatorial runoff election that ultimately Senator Jon Ossoff won. So these are some of the text messages that CNN got, and here's what the text message says. Here's the plan. Let's keep this close hold, Penrose wrote to Doug London. We only have until Saturday to decide if we're going to use this report to try to decertify the Senate runoff election, or if we hold it for a bigger moment, Penrose wrote, referring to a potential lawsuit. And then there was a January 19 text message. If you can draft a report for review on Friday morning with Charles Bundren, that would be best. And what they're talking about in these messages is now, again, they had people who went in and basically stole election data from Coffee County, right? They weren't supposed to be in there. They downloaded Coffee County election data, and then they uploaded that to a system that was controlled by the Trump campaign. Now they want to write reports on it to provide false information about the election results, in theory, that try to overturn the results of the election. That's what's going on there. And then you connect with these individuals we're also doing in Antrim County, Michigan, for example, which in many ways was like a test run of what to do in Coffee County. So one of the things you may recall that took place as well, remember there was this big December 18th meeting where like Giuliani and Flynn and Sidney Powell, and then the various other like lawyers who considered themselves Team Normal versus Team Crazy. Remember this from the January 6th committee hearing? So you had, other people in there who were supposed to be like Team Normal, for example, these lawyers, associated with Trump who were yelling at Team Crazy, and they're all screaming at each other, and so that happens on December 18th because, Team Crazy wants to seize voting machines and declare martial law and all of that. But then shortly thereafter, what begins to happen is, even though Team Normal thinks that they prevailed, actually Team Crazy had a backup plan by basically sending these people into these local election offices, trying to get the data because they couldn't seize the voting machines, but they seized the data by having basically moles in the election offices. They seized the data, and then they tried to prepare reports. And so, for example, a similar situation of what happened in Coffee County happened in Antrim County in Michigan, for example, which is under criminal investigation there as well by the state attorney general and by special counsel Jack Smith. Then Trump people took that data, they put it in their lawsuits, and they tried to manipulate the data. Ultimately, all that data was debunked. But when people like Lindell and Giuliani and Powell were saying they got their hands on this data, what seems like happened was it was the data that was actually essentially stolen from these local county election offices, and then manipulated and tried to weaponize to justify their positions in their lawsuits that they were filing, but ultimately that was debunked. So that brings us to the racketeering aspect of this, because you now have these operatives who are going into election offices. They're stealing election data that they're not supposed to have. They're then funneling it to kind of mid-level people like the Penroses and the Logans, and the Charles Bundrins, who are preparing reports and trying to synthesize this data and weaponize the data. And then at the next tier, you've got your Sidney Powells and your Giulianis and your Mike Flynns, who are then out there on all of the right-wing shows and on Fox and all the echo chamber, the MAGA fascist echo chamber media, basically spreading the disinformation by trying to manipulate this data. And ultimately that traces itself to Donald Trump. And that's where the RICO and racketeering aspect, goes into just that level, right? There's so much other misconduct that Donald Trump engaged in that are likely susceptible to criminal charges. Threatening the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, find me the votes or else. And when you see that, when you hear him saying, find me the votes, now that we see the conduct of people like Penrose and Logan and Bundrin and Giuliani and Sidney Powell, that wasn't hyperbole, find me the votes. Like, they were trying to find votes. And one of the ways they were doing it was trying to gain access to breached election data that they shouldn't have had in the first place, right? So in addition to the threats to Secretary of State Raffensperger, the fake elector scheme, which is its whole other criminal conduct, people falsely representing they're the real electors when Georgia, for example, voted for President Biden. Another criminal case for a RICO and racketeering was these criminal breaches taking place of local election offices, getting this data unlawfully, and ultimately having a system where this was filtered to Donald Trump at the highest levels. And, that's connecting to John Eastman and Donald Trump's other legal team that was trying to weaponize this data. So all of that is what ultimately a RICO and racketeering case can be, because you got your foot soldiers who walk into these election offices, you've got your mid-level people, you got kind of your next tier, your next lieutenants, all the way to Donald Trump, and how and you could connect them through this RICO and racketeering. That's how you're able to connect them. So that's what's going on there. Pay attention to the names Penrose, Logan, Bundrin, and of course, the names Giuliani and Sidney Powell. But, good find by CNN on those text messages from Penrose and Logan and referencing Bundrin. And I'm sure Special Counsel Jack Smith and, of course, Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis is all over this. I'm Ben Meiselas from the MeidasTouch Network. Hit subscribe. We're on our way to 1.5 million subscribers thanks to your incredible support. Also, wherever you get your audio podcasts, subscribe to the MeidasTouch podcast. It's free. And if you want to become a member of our Patreon, just go to patreon.com/MeidasTouch. Got a lot of great content on our Patreon that I think you'll enjoy. patreon.com/MeidasTouch. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.
Lock him up! Indictment season is upon us. Celebrate with the new Indictment Season t-shirt and v-neck exclusively at store.MeidasTouch.com.